What if I told you that the calendar hanging on your wall was not built for you? What if the months you live inside, the months you plan inside, the months you grieve and celebrate and pray inside, were assembled by men who did not consult your ancestors, did not consider your seasons, did not know your God, by the names your people used to call him? What if March, this month, the month you are standing in right now, is not the third month of the year the way you were taught? What if it was the first? What if somebody moved it? What if somebody picked up the beginning of time as your people understood it, slid it 2 positions to the left, and handed you a calendar with the seams showing, and told you not to look too closely? Because here is what the record shows. Before the Roman Empire restructured the year, before Julius Caesar and before Gregory, March was the first month. Not symbolically, literally, the month of beginnings, the month of the thaw. The month when the earth opened back up and said, "I am ready again." The names of the later months still carry the evidence: September, October, November, December, Septem, Octo, Novem, Decem. 7, 8, 9, 10. But we call them months 9 through 12. Someone moved the starting line, and nobody told you. Now stay with me, because I am not here to talk about Roman history. I am here to talk about what Black spiritual communities across the African diaspora communities, separated by oceans, by generations, by centuries of forced forgetting, have always known about this time of year. What they kept, what they practiced, what they passed down in whispers when the practice itself was illegal, what they encoded in church revivals and root work and ancestor tables and fasting seasons, so that the knowledge could survive even when the language around it could not. The new moon of March is not a metaphor. It is not a wellness trend. It is not something that was invented on social media last year by people who discovered crystals. It is a calendar. It is a theology. It is a survival strategy that is older than the empire that tried to erase it. And the communities that kept it are still keeping it quietly, faithfully, and in many cases without fully knowing why. Only knowing that their grandmothers did it, and their grandmothers' mothers did it. And somewhere at the end of that chain is a woman standing in soil that was never called America, marking the return of the new moon in March, and knowing in her body that time was beginning again. Today I am going to show you that this is not coincidence. I am going to show you that the Yoruba tradition in West Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Hoodoo practitioners of the American South, the Rastafari elders of Jamaica, the Kemetic spiritual communities that are growing across this country right now in 2026, that all of these communities, without coordinating with each other, without sharing a single institution, without a common language, arrived at the same sacred understanding about March. And when you see how many different rivers flow into the same place, you stop calling it coincidence. You start calling it truth. Do not click away. Every layer of what I am about to show you builds on the one before it. This is not a video you can come back to later and pick up in the middle. The evidence is cumulative. The argument is architectural. Stay with me from this moment to the very end. Let me tell you something before we go any further. When you were growing up, did anyone in your church, your household, your community, ever stop and say, the way we mark time was not handed down from God, it was handed down from Rome? Did your Sunday school teacher ever pause mid-lesson and say, the calendar this country runs on was designed in 1582 by a pope, and your ancestors were not in that room? Did anyone ever tell you that before that calendar existed, before that system was imposed on the world through colonization and forced assimilation, your people had their own relationship with the moon, their own seasons of reflection, their own new year? And that new year looked nothing like January 1st? No, they did not tell you that. And that silence is not accidental. That silence is architectural. Here is what I want to do today. I am going to build this case the way a scholar builds a case. Source by source, tradition by tradition, continent by continent. I am not asking you to take anything on faith alone. I'm going to show you the evidence and let the pattern speak for itself. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many black spiritual traditions treat March as a sacred threshold. You will know the specific practices attached to the new moon of this month across multiple traditions. You will see the documented history of how those practices were suppressed and how they survived anyway. And you will understand why this moment, right now, in 2026, is one of the most important times in living memory to reclaim the spiritual calendar that was always yours. Here is the roadmap. We are going to start with time itself, who controls it, who built the system you live inside, and what was lost when that system replaced what came before. Then, we are going to travel across traditions, because this is not one community's story. This is a diaspora-wide story. We are going to open the specific practices of the new moon of March, one by one. Not just name them, but look inside them, understand what they contain, and ask the question that mainstream religious education has never wanted to answer. Why do so many black spiritual traditions, across so many centuries and so many miles of separation, agree on this one threshold of the year? Then we are going to connect all of this to what is happening right now, because the recovery of these sacred calendars is not ancient news, it is current news. It is happening in cities and living rooms and online communities as you watch this video. And then we are going to pray together, because what I am about to lay before you is too large and too long suppressed to carry without God. After this video, you will never look at March the same way again. You will never look at a new moon the same way again. You will never sit inside a season without knowing that your ancestors assigned it a meaning, a specific, intentional, spiritually significant meaning, and that meaning was taken from you, hidden from you, or was simply never taught to you, because the people doing the teaching did not know it themselves. This is not an attack on your faith. This is not anti-church. This is not about replacing what you believe with something else. This is an invitation to a fuller understanding, a deeper practice, a relationship with sacred time that has not been filtered through the lens of empire. The new moon is rising, and it has been waiting for you. Let us begin. Let us start with something that sounds simple, but is not simple at all. What is a calendar? Most people would say, a calendar is just a way of tracking days, a practical tool, a grid on the wall that tells you when your dentist appointment is and how many Saturdays are left before Christmas. Nothing political about it, nothing spiritual about it. Just a neutral system for organizing time. But that answer is wrong. A calendar is never neutral. A calendar is a declaration of values. It is a statement about what matters. It encodes, in its very structure, a philosophy about what is sacred, what is worth marking, what deserves to be set apart from ordinary time. Every culture that has ever existed on this earth built a calendar, and every one of those calendars was different, because every one of those cultures had a different answer to the question that sits underneath all calendar making, which is this: what is time for? And here is the thing that your history class almost certainly never told you. The calendar you live inside right now, the Gregorian calendar, the one that says today is March and January was the beginning, and the year is divided into 12 months of unequal length, for reasons that have never fully made sense. That calendar is not old. It is not ancient wisdom handed down from the beginning of human civilization. It was published in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII, to be precise, who issued a papal bull called Inter Gravissimus to reform the calendar system of the Roman Catholic Church. 1582. That is not ancient. The printing press was already 40 years old when that calendar was announced. Shakespeare was 18 years old. The transatlantic slave trade was already well underway. And the communities whose spiritual calendars we are going to explore today, the Yoruba people of West Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox faithful, the Akan of Ghana, the ancestors of the people who would be carried in chains across the Atlantic. Those communities were not consulted. They were not in the room. They did not vote. Their relationship with time, their sacred understanding of seasons and moons and thresholds, was not considered relevant to the conversation. The absence was not incidental. The absence was the point. Now here is the first piece of evidence I want to place before you, because I told you I am going to build this case layer by layer, and I meant it. Look at the names of the months, not the meanings people assign to them now. The original Latin meanings. September comes from septem, the Latin word for seven. October comes from octo, 8. November from novem, 9. December from decem, 10. 7, 8, 9, 10. But on the calendar you use right now, September is the 9th month. October is the 10th. November is the 11th. December is the 12th. The numbers are off by exactly 2. Why? Because for most of Rome's early history, the year began in March. March was month 1. April was month 2. All the way down to December, which was month 10 Decem, exactly as its name says. The calendar made numerical sense. Then, in 153 BC, Roman consuls began taking office on January 1st for political and military reasons, and the beginning of the official year was shifted. Then Julius Caesar reformed the calendar in 46 BC. Then Gregory reformed it again in 1582. 2,000 years of adjustments, reforms, political decisions about when the year begins and ends, and nobody erased the evidence. The evidence is still sitting right there in the names of the months, in plain sight, for anyone who looks closely enough to see it. Somebody moved the starting line. March used to be the beginning, and before it was politically inconvenient to acknowledge it, the entire ancient world understood why. Not because of Roman consuls, not because of papal bulls, because of the earth itself. March is when the northern hemisphere tilts back toward the sun. March is when the ground thaws after winter. March is when seeds that have been dormant for months split open underground and push their first green thread upward toward light. March is when the vernal equinox arrives, the moment when day and night are exactly equal, when light and darkness are in perfect balance, when the earth signals that the long contraction of winter is over and the expansion of spring has begun. Every agricultural society on earth recognized this. Every civilization that depended on the land, which is to say, every civilization that has ever existed, understood that this was the moment of genuine beginning. Not January 1st, which falls in the dead of winter in the northern hemisphere, when nothing is growing and nothing is beginning, and the earth is as contracted and still as it will ever be. But March, the real threshold, the moment the earth itself says, I am ready again. And this is where it gets important, because this recognition is not unique to one culture. It is not a European insight, or an Asian insight, or an African insight. It is a human insight. But I want to show you specifically how Black and African spiritual traditions encoded this understanding, because the depth of that encoding has been systematically minimized, mislabeled, and in many cases deliberately destroyed. Let us start with the Hebrew calendar, because most people in Black Christian communities know the Bible far better than they know the calendar the Bible was actually written inside of. Open your Bible to Exodus 12:2. God is speaking to Moses and Aaron before the first Passover, and he says, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." The month he is referring to is Nisan, the month of Passover, the month of the Exodus, the month of liberation. And Nisan falls in March and April, not January, not the dead of winter. The God of the Hebrew Scriptures told his people that their year began in the spring. The Hebrew sacred calendar, the calendar that the entire Old Testament was written inside, begins in March. The first month of the sacred year in the tradition that produced the Bible is the same threshold that every black spiritual tradition we are going to examine today has always recognized. That is not coincidence. That is convergence. And convergence of that kind demands an explanation. Now I want to show you something that the silence around black spiritual history has kept from view for a long time. There is a meeting that happened in 1582. Pope Gregory XIII and his astronomers and his advisors gathered to fix the Julian calendar. They calculated the drift. They adjusted the leap year formula. They moved the calendar forward by 10 days to correct the accumulated error. And in doing so, they established the system that the entire colonial world would go on to impose on every people, every nation, every community it touched. That meeting was in Rome. The scholarship was European. The framework was Catholic. The vision of time embedded in that calendar, time as linear, time as administrative, time as something to be managed by institutions rather than felt in the body, and the soil was a specifically European Christian vision. And it is not the only vision. The Yoruba people of what is now Nigeria and Benin did not measure time in 7-day weeks. They measured it in 4-day cycles, structured around the Ifa oracle and the movements of the Orishas. Their sacred calendar was lunar. Their new year was not fixed to an arbitrary winter date, but moved with the moon and the agricultural season. The most important spiritual consultations of the year happened at specific lunar thresholds, and one of the most significant of those thresholds fell in what we would call late February and March, when the dry season broke and the first rains came. The Akan people of Ghana, ancestors of a significant portion of the African diaspora in the Americas, structured their calendar around a 42-day cycle called the A-day cycle, with 2 major observances per cycle for honoring ancestors and consulting the spiritual authorities of the community. Their sacred calendar was not an abstract system. It was tied directly to the rhythms of the natural world, to rain, to harvest, to the behavior of the sun and moon. And the transition into what we call spring was a recognized threshold, a time when the veil between the living and the ancestors was understood to be thinner, communication more direct, spiritual work more potent. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which we will return to in much greater depth, follows a calendar that is 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorian calendar and structures the year around 13 months rather than 12. Their month of Megabit, which falls in our March, is one of the most spiritually intensive periods of the year, a time of deep fasting, intense prayer, and communal reflection before the celebration of Fasika, the Ethiopian Passover. It is not an accident that this period of reckoning falls in March. It is a feature. It has always been there. It was there before Gregory was born. Now, I want to ask you a question that I need you to sit with before we move to the next section. If the Yoruba calendar honors March as a threshold of spiritual beginning, and the Hebrew sacred calendar begins in March, and the Ethiopian Orthodox calendar places its most intensive season of reflection in March, and the ancient Roman calendar originally began in March, and the earth itself begins its annual renewal in March. If all of these systems, independently, arrive at the same conclusion, what does that tell you? It tells you that the people who moved the starting line had a reason to move it, because when you control the calendar, you control more than time. You control attention. You control when people gather and when they disperse. You control what they mark as sacred and what they treat as ordinary. You control the rhythm of their spiritual life. And if you can replace a people's calendar with yours, you do not need to destroy their religion directly. You just need to make their sacred thresholds invisible. Fold them into ordinary Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Make the new moon of March just another day on the way to the end of the month, with no ceremony attached, no gathering required, no ancestors acknowledged, no reflection demanded. That is not a theory. That is a documented strategy. The laws passed in colonial American states that forbade enslaved Africans from gathering, from playing drums, from practicing traditional ceremonies. Those laws were not random acts of cruelty. They were calendar destruction. They were the legislative erasure of the mechanism by which a community marks sacred time together. When you cannot gather at the new moon, you cannot practice the rituals of the new moon. When those rituals are not practiced, they begin to fade. When they fade long enough, the people who come after forget that they ever existed. And eventually you have a people who celebrate the new year on January 1st, in the dead of winter, in the middle of the Earth's most contracted season, with no spiritual content attached, no ancestral acknowledgement, no ritual reflection, no connection to the land, no memory of what the real beginning felt like. That is what was taken. But here is what the silence does not tell you. It was not fully taken. It survived. In fragments and whispers and grandmothers' habits and church revival seasons and root work and the specific way certain communities have always treated this time of year without being able to fully articulate why. The memory went underground. It encoded itself in practices that looked innocuous enough to survive spring cleaning, revival season, ancestor tables, the particular quality of prayer in March that many black Christians have always felt, without being taught a reason for it. The knowledge survived because the people who carried it understood, even without a language for it, that some things are worth keeping, even when keeping them costs you something. Stay with me, because now that you understand what was taken and how it was taken, I am ready to take you inside the specific traditions that kept it. I am ready to show you what the new moon of March actually looks like, when a community that never forgot it gathers to observe it. And what you are about to see is going to permanently change the way you understand your own spiritual inheritance. Before I take you inside the specific practices of the new moon of March, I need to take you somewhere first. I need to introduce you to the people, because the traditions we are talking about did not fall from the sky. They were not invented last year by people looking for an alternative to mainstream religion. They were not assembled from internet searches or borrowed wholesale from cultures that had nothing to do with the African experience. They were built over millennia by communities who paid close attention to the world around them, to the sky, to the soil, to the behavior of the moon, to the patterns that repeated themselves year after year and generation after generation, until those patterns became language, and that language became ceremony, and that ceremony became identity. These are not footnotes. These are vaults. And before you can understand what the new moon of March means inside these traditions, you need to understand who these traditions are. Not in the travel brochure sense, not in the Black History Month display case sense, in the living, breathing, theologically serious, historically documented sense. So, let me introduce them to you properly. Begin here, because this is one of the oldest continuously practiced spiritual systems on the surface of the earth. The Yoruba people of what is now southwestern Nigeria, Benin, and Togo have maintained a spiritual system called Ifa for at least 4,000 years. Some scholars place its origins significantly earlier. What is documented is this. Ifa is not a folk religion. It is not superstition. It is a sophisticated, encyclopedic body of knowledge, oral scripture, really comprising 256 primary chapters called Odu, each containing hundreds of verses, stories, prescriptions, and cosmological teachings. The full corpus of Ifa oral literature was inscribed on the UNESCO representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2008. The United Nations formally recognized it as a contribution to world civilization. That is not a minor credential. At the center of the Ifa system is a relationship between the human community and a set of divine principles called the Orishas, archetypal spiritual forces that govern different aspects of existence. Oshun governs rivers, sweetness, fertility, and love. Ogun governs iron, labor, and righteous conflict. Yemoja governs the ocean and the primal waters of life. Shango governs thunder, justice, and transformative power. Each of them is not a god in the Western polytheistic sense. They are more accurately understood as aspects of the one divine reality, Olodumare, filtered through specific domains of human experience. And the Ifa calendar is built entirely around the moon. Every new moon is a spiritual event. Every new moon is an occasion for consultation with the Odu, for prayer, for offerings, for the realignment of the community's collective intention with the will of Olodumare. The Yoruba week is 4 days, not 7, a cycle tied to the rotation of specific orishas and their corresponding energies. Time in the Ifa system is not linear. It is cyclical. It breathes in and out like a living thing. And the new moon of March, which falls in the season when the rains return to West Africa after the long, dry harmattan, is one of the most auspicious new moons of the year. It is the moon of new beginnings, the moon of Oshun's sweetness, returning to the earth after the bitterness of winter. The moon, when planting intentions and planting seeds, are the same spiritual act. This system survived the Middle Passage. It crossed the Atlantic in the bodies of enslaved Yoruba people who carried it the only way they could, in memory, in song, in ceremony, practiced in secret, encoded in the Catholic saints. Their enslavers imposed on them so that Oshun became Our Lady of Charity and Shango became Saint Barbara, and the tradition continued breathing underneath the surface of enforced conversion. In Cuba, it became Santeria, now called Lucumi or Regla de Ocha. In Brazil, it became Candomblé. In Trinidad, it became Orisha tradition. In the United States, it survived in fragments and is now being actively reconstructed by a growing community of practitioners who are finding their way back to what their ancestors could not openly keep. Every one of these diaspora expressions of Yoruba tradition still honors the lunar calendar. Every one of them still marks the new moon. Every one of them still recognizes March. Now I need to take you to a place that most people in the African diaspora have not been taught to claim as their own, even though the connection is direct, documented, and spiritually significant. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. Not old in the sense that European Christianity is old in a category that European Christianity cannot touch. The Ethiopian eunuch of Acts chapter 8, the treasurer of the Kandake, the Queen of Ethiopia, a man of enormous political authority who had traveled to Jerusalem seeking God and was reading the scroll of Isaiah in his chariot on the road home. That man carried the gospel back to the African continent in the 1st century. Within decades of the resurrection, before Paul's letters were finished, before the Gospels were written down in their final form, before a single church council had met to debate anything, Ethiopia did not receive Christianity through Rome. Ethiopia did not receive Christianity through colonial missionaries. Ethiopia received the gospel in a chariot on a desert road, carried by an African man who was already seeking, already reading, already hungry for the truth before Philip ran alongside him and offered to help him understand what he was reading. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been continuously practicing since that 1st century. It has a liturgical tradition, a manuscript tradition, a theological tradition, and a calendar tradition that developed entirely independently of Roman Christianity. Its canon of scripture contains 81 books. Its liturgical language is Ge'ez, one of the oldest written languages in the world. Its rock-hewn churches at Lalibela, carved directly from living stone in the 12th century, are among the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history. And its calendar is not the Gregorian calendar. The Ethiopian calendar has 13 months, 12 months of 30 days each, and a 13th month of 5 or 6 days called Pagume. The Ethiopian New Year, called Enkutatash, falls in September. But the month of Megabit, the Ethiopian month that overlaps with our March, is one of the most spiritually intensive periods in the entire Ethiopian Orthodox calendar. It falls within the Great Fast, the 55-day Lenten period called Tsom Nebiat and Tsom Hemamat, which leads to Fasika, the Ethiopian Passover, the celebration of the resurrection. March, in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, is the month of deep interior work. It is the month of fasting, of extended prayer, of communal examination. It is the month when the community turns inward together, strips away the distractions of ordinary time, and prepares the ground of the Spirit for what is coming. Not because a Roman pope scheduled it that way, because the Ethiopian Church has been doing it that way for 1700 years, following a calendar that was never colonized, inside a nation that was never conquered. When you understand that Ethiopia is the only nation on the African continent that successfully repelled full European colonization, that at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Emperor Menelik II led Ethiopian forces against the invading Italian army and turned them back, in a victory so decisive it shocked the entire colonial world. When you understand that fact, alongside the fact that Ethiopia also preserved the most complete biblical canon on earth and has maintained an unbroken liturgical tradition for 17 centuries, you stop seeing coincidence. You start seeing architecture. You start seeing a people assigned to guard something, and guarding it. Now I need to bring you closer to home, because some of you watching this were raised in the American South, or raised by people who were, and the tradition I am about to describe is part of your inheritance, whether you were ever told about it or not. Hoodoo is not voodoo. Let me be clear about that before we go further, because the conflation has been used to dismiss both. Hoodoo is a distinctly African-American folk spiritual tradition that developed primarily in the American South, among enslaved and later free black communities. It draws from multiple African spiritual systems, Yoruba, Congo, Fon, and others, combined with elements of the Hebrew Bible, Native American plant knowledge, and European folk magic that enslaved people encountered and selectively incorporated. What survived most powerfully in hoodoo was the relationship with the natural world. The understanding that the land speaks, that plants carry spiritual properties, that certain times are more powerful for certain kinds of work than others, that the moon matters, that timing matters, that you do not do the same work on a waxing moon that you do on a waning moon, and that the new moon is a specific kind of threshold that calls for a specific kind of attention. And March in hoodoo tradition carries a particular significance that practitioners have maintained for generations without always having academic language to explain why. It is the time of spring roots. The early plants that push up in the first warm weeks of the year carry a specific spiritual potency that they do not carry at any other time. The timing of their emergence, their first appearance after the dormancy of winter, makes them especially powerful for workings of new beginning, of clearing away the old, of opening doors that have been closed. The tradition of spring cleaning in Black American households, the deep, thorough, almost ritualistic cleaning that happens every year in March and April, is not simply practical housekeeping. It is a descendant of a spiritual practice. The removal of the old to make space for the new, the clearing of accumulated stagnation from the winter months, the literal and symbolic opening of windows and doors to let fresh air, fresh energy, fresh spiritual alignment into the space where a family lives. Many of the women who practiced this most faithfully did not call it spiritual work. They called it what their mothers called it. But the specificity of the timing, the regularity of the practice, the almost ceremonial quality that many black families describe in how these traditions were carried out, that did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere. It came from someone. And that someone knew something about March. When Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, flew to Jamaica in April 1966, an estimated 100,000 Jamaicans flooded the Kingston airport to receive him. They overwhelmed the security. They climbed onto the plane. Some of them wept. Haile Selassie himself, by multiple accounts, was moved to tears by what he witnessed. That reception was not just political enthusiasm, it was spiritual recognition. The Rastafari movement, which had begun in Jamaica in the early 1930s, following the coronation of Haile Selassie in 1930, had identified the Ethiopian emperor as a messianic figure, the fulfillment of a prophecy from Revelation 5:5, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the returned king. Whether or not you share that theological interpretation, the spiritual architecture behind it is important to understand. Rastafari is a tradition built on a profound, deliberate, theologically serious connection to Ethiopia, to the Ethiopian Bible, to the Ethiopian calendar, to the Ethiopian understanding of sacred time. Rastafari practitioners do not observe the Gregorian calendar as spiritually authoritative. They orient their spiritual lives around a different understanding of time, cyclical, agricultural, rooted in the natural world, attuned to seasons and moons in a way that the calendar on your wall simply is not. In Rastafari understanding, March carries significance as a threshold between seasons, a time of spiritual recalibration, of meditation, of what practitioners call reasoning, the communal gathering for deep conversation about scripture, about Jah, about the condition of the people. The equinox is not a scientific curiosity in Rastafari tradition. It is a spiritual event. The moment when light and darkness are balanced is a moment to ask, where am I in that balance? Where is my community? What needs to be released? What needs to be cultivated? Finally, I want to introduce you to a tradition that is ancient in its roots, but contemporary in its current expression, and that is growing rapidly in black communities across the United States, the United Kingdom, and the African continent itself. Kemetic spirituality. Spirituality, rooted in the religious practices of ancient Kemet, which we call Egypt, is not new. It did not begin on the internet. The civilization of the Nile Valley maintained one of the most sophisticated spiritual systems in human history for more than 3,000 years. The theology, the cosmology, the understanding of the soul and its relationship to the divine, the elaborate funerary traditions designed to guide the spirit through the afterlife, all of this was developed, refined, and practiced by African people in Africa across a time span that makes European Christianity look like a recent invention. The Kemetic calendar was solar, and it recognized 3 seasons. Akhet, the season of inundation, when the Nile flooded and deposited the rich soil that made the civilization possible. Peret, the season of emergence, when the floodwaters receded and planting began. And Shemu, the season of harvest. The transition between Akhet and Peret, the emergence, the moment when the land reappeared from under the water and became fertile again, was one of the most sacred transitions in the Kemetic spiritual year. It corresponded, in the Nile Valley's agricultural reality, to the late winter and early spring period, to what we call March. The festival of Wepet Renpet, literally the opening of the year, was observed at the beginning of the Kemetic calendar as a moment of cosmic renewal, a time to honor Thoth, the divine principle of time and wisdom and sacred writing, and to realign the community's spiritual intention with the creative force of the universe. Contemporary Kemetic practitioners, many of them Black Americans and Africans in the diaspora, who have recovered this tradition through rigorous study of ancient texts and archaeological records, observe Wepet Renpet as a living practice, and many of them observe it in alignment with the vernal equinox in March. Now, step back with me for a moment and look at what we have just laid on the table. The Yoruba tradition honors the new moon of March as the beginning of the planting season and one of the most auspicious new moons of the spiritual year. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church places its most intensive season of fasting and spiritual reflection in March. Hoodoo practitioners have always recognized March as the most potent time for spiritual clearing and new beginnings. Rastafari tradition treats the spring equinox as a threshold of spiritual recalibration. Kemetic spirituality honors the late winter and early spring as the season of emergence, of opening, of cosmic renewal. And underneath all of them, the Hebrew sacred calendar, which most of these traditions either drew from directly or stood alongside, begins its sacred year in March. 5 traditions, multiple continents, centuries of separation, different languages, different theologies, different ritual structures, different names for the divine, same threshold, same month, same moon. You do not have to explain why they all landed here. The convergence is the evidence. The convergence is the message. And when you see a message that persistent, that consistent, that geographically widespread, a message that survived the Middle Passage and the plantation and the colonial mission school and the legislative erasure of African ceremony, you owe it to yourself and to every ancestor who kept it alive to stop calling it coincidence. Now I am ready to show you the evidence. Document by document, text by text, layer by layer. Stay with me. I told you I was going to build this case like a scholar builds a case, layer by layer, source by source. So here is the first layer of evidence, and I need you to pay close attention because what I am about to show you is not interpretation. It is not opinion. It is not spiritual feeling dressed up as fact. It is documented, verifiable, cross-referenced evidence that the sacred relationship between Black and African spiritual traditions and the new moon of March is not cultural coincidence. It is theological architecture. It is built into the oldest texts your tradition carries, and it has been sitting there in plain sight the entire time. Open your Bible to Numbers 28-11. Read it slowly. On the first of every month, present to the Lord a burnt offering. The first of every month. The Hebrew phrase behind that translation is Rosh Chodesh, literally, the head of the month, the new moon. The moment when the moon disappears from the night sky and then reappears as the thinnest sliver of light on the horizon. That moment, in the Hebrew sacred system, was not a passive astronomical event. It was a commanded observance. God told Moses directly, "Mark this, gather, bring an offering. Do not let this threshold pass without spiritual acknowledgement." Now turn to Psalm 81-3. The instruction is even more direct. Blow the ram's horn at the new moon, at the full moon, on our festival day. A horn, a sound, a public announcement that something sacred is happening right now, in this moment, and the community is required to respond together. Now turn to Isaiah 66-23. This is a prophecy about the future, about the restored world, the healed creation, the fullness of what God intends. And here is how Isaiah describes it. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. Not once a year, not on a fixed holiday decided by a committee. From one new moon to another. The rhythm of the restored world is lunar. The heartbeat of the healed creation is the moon. Isaiah looked forward into the fullness of time, and saw a world that still marked the new moon as sacred. That is 3 separate books of your Bible, Numbers, Psalms, Isaiah, all treating the new moon not as a primitive superstition to be outgrown, but as a divinely established rhythm of spiritual life. And yet, somewhere between the writing of those texts and the Christianity that was handed to most Black Americans, that rhythm disappeared. The new moon became invisible. The lunar calendar became something associated with paganism. The very practice that God commanded in the Hebrew Scriptures became, in the minds of many church-going people, something suspicious, something other, something that sounds like it belongs to a tradition that has nothing to do with them. How does that happen? The same way everything else happened. Someone made a decision about what you were allowed to keep. And the practice of honoring the new moon did not survive the translation into Roman Christianity, because Roman Christianity was built on a solar calendar, and a solar calendar has no room for the moon as a sacred instrument. The moon became decorative, romantic, poetic, but not theological, not required, not commanded, except in the traditions that were never absorbed into Roman Christianity. Now here is the second exhibit, and this one requires you to travel. Travel to Mali, to the Bandiagara escarpment, a sandstone cliff rising 600 meters above the plains of West Africa, where the Dogon people have lived for centuries in villages carved into the rock face itself. The Dogon are not a large population. They are not a politically powerful nation. They do not appear frequently in the textbooks your children carry to school. But what the Dogon possess is one of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge systems ever documented in human history. Western astronomers confirmed the existence of Sirius B, the white dwarf companion star of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, in 1862, using a telescope. They photographed it for the first time in 1970. But when French anthropologist Marcel Griaule documented Dogon astronomical knowledge in the 1930s, he found that the Dogon already knew about Sirius B. They knew it was a small, dense, heavy star that orbited Sirius A in a 50-year cycle. They had ceremonial dances for it. They had a name for it. They had incorporated it into their spiritual calendar for generations before Western science caught up to what they already knew. The Dogon measured time by the moon. Their festival calendar was lunar, and the transition between dry season and rainy season, falling in late February and March, was marked by one of their most significant communal ceremonies, a time of collective spiritual preparation for what was coming. A new moon of reckoning and readiness. Not because a pope scheduled it, because the sky told them so, and they had been listening to the sky for longer than most civilizations have existed. Now, the third exhibit. And this one brings us back to the continent of Africa, as it was before the word continent had a European name attached to it. Ancient Kemet, the civilization of the Nile Valley, the builders of the pyramids, the writers of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the text your history class calls the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the architects of a theological system so sophisticated that Greek philosophers traveled to Kemet specifically to study under African priests. Pythagoras studied in Kemet. Thales studied in Kemet. Plato spent time in Kemet. The foundations of Western philosophy drew directly from African theological thought. And in Kemet, the moon was not a decorative element of the night sky. The moon was Thoth Jehuti, the divine principle of time, wisdom, sacred writing, and cosmic order. Thoth was the keeper of the calendar. Thoth was the scribe of heaven. And the new moon, in the Kemetic sacred calendar, was a moment of direct access to that principle, a moment when the cosmic clock reset, when the slate of the previous cycle was cleared, when new intention could be planted in the spiritual soil of the universe with maximum potency. The Kemetic month began with the new moon. Every month, not metaphorically, structurally, The new moon was the first day of the month, built into the architecture of the calendar itself. And the new moon of the spring season, falling in what we now call March, was the new moon that carried the specific energy of Wepet Renpet, the opening of the year, the cosmic reset, the moment when Thoth's scales were cleared and the new cycle of creation could begin. 4,000 years of documented civilization, 4,000 years of treating the new moon of spring as a sacred threshold, 4,000 years before the Gregorian calendar existed, 4,000 years before Rome, 4,000 years of African people looking at the sky in March and saying, "This is the moment. This is when we begin again." Now step back and look at the full pattern of what we just laid on this table. The Hebrew Bible commands the new moon as a sacred observance, and its most important new moon falls in March. The Dogon of Mali encode their deepest astronomical knowledge into a lunar calendar with a major threshold in March. Ancient Kemet structures its entire sacred year around the new moon, and specifically honors the March new moon as the opening of cosmic time. The traditions we examined in the previous section, Yoruba, Ethiopian, Hoodoo, Rastafari, Kemetic revival, all arrive at the same place from different directions. That pattern does not look like coincidence. It does not look like parallel accidents. It looks like a language that multiple African and African-descended communities were all fluent in, that got systematically suppressed by colonial religious institutions, and that survived anyway in fragments, in ceremonies. In the specific way certain grandmothers treated the first new moon of spring without being able to explain exactly why. The moon is not a symbol in these traditions. It never was. It is an instrument, a compass, a clock that was never colonized, and March is when it speaks the loudest. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you next is how that language was systematically targeted for erasure, and why the fact that it survived at all is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of the human spirit. There is a law passed in the colony of South Carolina in 1740 that I need you to know about. It is called the Negro Act, and buried inside its clauses, alongside prohibitions on enslaved people learning to read and write and move freely and earn their own money, is this: enslaved Africans were forbidden from beating drums, not forbidden from making weapons, not forbidden from organizing militias, forbidden from beating drums. Think about why. A drum is not just an instrument in African spiritual tradition. A drum is a calendar. A drum is a clock. A drum is the mechanism by which a community announces to itself and to the spiritual world that a sacred threshold is being crossed right now, at this moment, and the community is required to respond. When the new moon arrived in Yoruba tradition, the drums spoke. When the Akan observed the Adai ceremony, the drums spoke. When the Fon people of Dahomey marked the turning of the agricultural season, the drums spoke. The drum was the technology of sacred time. It was how a community said together, "This moment is not ordinary. This moment is marked. This moment matters." When you silence the drums, you do not just stop the music. You stop the calendar. You make every day the same. You collapse sacred time into secular time and leave a people with no instrument for marking the difference between a threshold and a Tuesday. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. And it did not stop with drums. The Negro Act of 1740 was one law in one colony. But the architecture of erasure it represented was replicated across every slave-holding society in the Americas, with local variations but a consistent underlying logic. Prohibit gathering, prohibit ceremony, prohibit the transmission of language, force conversion to Christianity on European terms, with a European calendar, with European sacred days replacing African ones. Make the new moon of March invisible. Make every moon invisible. Replace the lunar calendar with the solar one, the African sacred year with the Gregorian one, the grandmother's knowledge with the missionary's catechism. The goal was not simply to extract labor. The goal was to produce a people who had no memory of what they were before the ship, a people who could not look at a calendar and find themselves in it, a people for whom March was just another month. And here is the part that should stop you cold. It almost worked. I said almost, because here is what the erasure could not reach. Here is what survived in the gaps between the prohibitions, in the silence after the drums were confiscated, in the bodies and memories of people who had no external mechanism left for keeping sacred time, but kept it anyway. In the praise houses and brush arbors of the American South, the secret gathering places that enslaved people called hush harbors, hidden in swamps and thickets away from the sight of overseers, something was preserved. Scholars who have studied these gatherings describe a practice called the ring shout, a counter-clockwise circular movement, feet shuffling, voices rising, bodies swaying in a collective rhythm that could last for hours. European observers who witnessed it and wrote about it consistently described it as wild, as primitive, as dangerously African. What they were actually seeing was ceremony. What they were actually seeing was a community marking sacred time, without drums, without the explicit language of their original tradition, with nothing but their bodies and their voices, and the knowledge, held somewhere below articulation, that this kind of gathering mattered. The ring shout happened most intensely at specific times of year. Scholars of African American religious history have documented that the intensity of these gatherings increased during late winter and early spring, during what we call March. The body remembered what the law tried to erase. Now I want to show you a second form of survival, because the erasure was not limited to the United States, and neither was the resistance. Travel to Brazil, to the city of Salvador da Bahia, where the largest African diaspora population outside of Africa has maintained a living spiritual tradition for 400 years under conditions of extraordinary violence and suppression. The tradition is called candomblé. It is rooted primarily in Yoruba spiritual practice, brought to Brazil by enslaved people from what is now Nigeria and Benin, and it has never stopped being practiced. The Portuguese colonial authorities banned it. The Catholic Church condemned it. The Brazilian government criminalized it as recently as the early 20th century. Police raided candomblé ceremonies and arrested practitioners. Sacred objects were confiscated and destroyed. Practitioners faced imprisonment, public humiliation, and physical violence for maintaining their tradition. Candomblé survived anyway. It survived because the communities that practiced it made a calculated decision to encode their tradition inside the Catholic framework that surrounded them. The Orishas were mapped onto Catholic saints. Shango became Saint Jerome. Yemoja became Our Lady of the Navigators. The ceremonies continued, wearing a Catholic surface that gave them just enough cover to endure. But underneath the surface, the lunar calendar was intact. The new moon observances continued. The seasonal thresholds were still marked. The March threshold was still honored. This is what cultural survival looks like when it operates under maximum pressure. It does not announce itself. It does not resist loudly. It bends just enough to avoid being broken, and it keeps the essential thing alive inside the bend. The essential thing, in this case, was the relationship with sacred time, the understanding that certain moments in the year are spiritually distinct, that the new moon of March is not an ordinary night, that something is required of the community at that threshold, and that requirement does not disappear because the people enforcing the erasure have made it dangerous to fulfill. Now I want to tell you about a woman. Her name was recorded only as Aunt Sally. She lived in Mississippi in the late 19th century. Born into enslavement, and she was known throughout her community as someone who understood roots and seasons and the particular properties of plants gathered at specific times of year. A researcher documenting Southern folk traditions in the 1890s wrote about her practice of gathering the first plants of spring at the new moon, and of conducting what she called a clearing of the house, a thorough removal of everything old and stagnant at that same time every year without fail. When the researcher asked her why she did it in March specifically, Aunt Sally said something that stopped him mid-note. She said, "That is when the ground opens back up. You got to be ready when the ground opens." She did not cite Yoruba tradition. She did not reference Kemetic cosmology. She did not know those words. But she knew that when the earth emerged from dormancy, when the soil became receptive again after the contraction of winter, that was the moment to clear out the old and plant the new. She knew that you had to be spiritually prepared before the ground opened, not after. She knew that the new moon of March was a threshold that required action, not passive observation. Nobody taught her that in a classroom. Nobody handed her a book that explained it. She learned it the way all the most durable knowledge gets transmitted, body to body, generation to generation, grandmother to granddaughter, in a chain of practice that stretched back across the Atlantic to a tradition that the slave ship could not fully confiscate because it lived in the hands and the habits and the seasonal instincts of the people who carried it. That chain is the evidence. Not one link, the whole chain. 400 years of women in the African diaspora, clearing their houses in March, gathering their roots at the new moon, feeling in their bodies that this threshold required something of them, without a shared institution, without a common text, without a formal religious structure to enforce the practice, just the knowledge itself, moving through time in the only vessel that was never successfully seized: the human body, the human memory, the human insistence on marking what is sacred, even when the marking itself carries a price. The drums were silenced. The calendars were replaced, the ceremonies were criminalized, the language was stripped away. But March kept arriving, and the people kept knowing. Stay with me, because now I am going to show you what that knowing looks like in 2026, how the communities that carried these fragments are putting them back together, and why this specific moment in history is the most important time in living memory to understand what they are rebuilding. Something is happening right now that nobody in mainstream media is covering. Not because it is small, because it is large enough to be inconvenient. Across the United States, across the United Kingdom, across West Africa and the Caribbean and Brazil, and every city where the African diaspora has planted roots, a generation of black people is turning around, not away from faith, toward a fuller one, not away from their ancestors, toward them. They are pulling out of the Christian framework that was handed to them, not because it failed them spiritually, but because they have begun to suspect, and in many cases confirm, that the framework they received was edited before it arrived, that the calendar they were given was not the one their ancestors built, that the sacred thresholds their great-grandmothers honored by instinct were real thresholds with real spiritual weight, and they were never explained because explanation required an acknowledgement that something had been taken. This generation is asking for the explanation, and the new moon of March is one of the places they are finding it. In 2023, a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center found that roughly 30% of Black Americans now identify with spiritual practices outside of or alongside traditional Christianity. That number has increased in every survey cycle since 2010. Among Black Americans between the ages of 18 and 35, the number is significantly higher. IFA practitioners in Atlanta, Houston, and New York City report that their communities have doubled in size in the past 5 years. Kemetic study groups that once met in living rooms are now filling conference halls. Online communities dedicated to ancestral veneration and lunar calendar practice have hundreds of thousands of followers, the majority of them black, the majority of them under 40. This is not a trend. It is a reclamation, and it is accelerating. But here is what I want you to understand about why March specifically has become a focal point of that reclamation. Because March exposes the seam. When you begin to study any of the traditions we have examined in this video, when you sit with an Ifa practitioner and learn how the lunar calendar structures spiritual life, when you read the Ethiopian Orthodox fasting calendar and see megabit sitting there in March like it has always been there, when you trace the hoodoo tradition of spring clearing back to its African roots, when you look at what the Hebrew Bible actually says about the new moon, you arrive at a moment of recognition that is difficult to describe and impossible to unfeel. The recognition is this: the calendar you were given skipped something, and what it skipped was not arbitrary. What it skipped was the threshold, the moment of genuine beginning. The moon that every African and African-descended spiritual tradition treated as the most auspicious new moon of the year was quietly folded into the middle of someone else's calendar and handed back to you with no label on. March became just a month. And the work of reclamation for a growing number of black spiritual practitioners in 2026 is the work of making March a threshold again. Now, I want to show you what that looks like on the ground. Not in theory, in practice. In real communities doing real work right now. In New Orleans, a community of women who practice a tradition they call ancestral hoodoo gather every new moon throughout the year. But the new moon of March is their most significant gathering of the year. They call it the opening. They spend the days before it in a fast, not a total fast, but a deliberate reduction and simplification of what they consume, physical and spiritual. They clean their homes in the traditional manner, moving from back to front, from interior to exterior, releasing the accumulated weight of winter. On the night of the new moon, they gather. They speak the names of their ancestors aloud. They plant seeds, actual seeds in actual soil, as a physical declaration of what they are beginning in the new cycle. And they pray, in terms that would be recognizable in any black church in America, but at a threshold that no black church in America has taught them to honor. In London, a Kemetic study group that formed on social media in 2019 and now meets regularly in a community center in Brixton observes Wepet Renpet every year at the vernal equinox. The majority of its members were raised Christian. Several of them are still Christian, holding both frameworks simultaneously, finding no contradiction in honoring the God of their upbringing at a threshold that their African ancestors would have recognized. Their Wepet Renpet gathering includes readings from ancient Kemetic texts, communal reflection on the cycle that is ending and the cycle that is beginning, and a practice of writing down what they are releasing before burning the paper as an offering to Thoth, the keeper of sacred time. In Accra, Lagos, and Ibadan, Ifa practitioners mark the new moon of March with ceremonies that have been continuously practiced for longer than any of the colonial institutions that tried to interrupt them. They are not reconstructing something lost. They are maintaining something preserved. And they are increasingly in digital conversation with diaspora practitioners in Atlanta and Toronto and Amsterdam, who are reconstructing, who are finding their way back, who are using every resource available, academic texts, oral tradition, direct mentorship from African elders, to rebuild what the ship and the plantation and the mission school tried to demolish. These communities are not all the same. They do not agree on everything. They use different names for the divine. They practice different rituals at different times, with different objects and different prayers. But they agree on this. March matters. The new moon matters. This threshold is real. And here is the question I want you to sit with before we move to the next section. The question I want you to carry forward into everything that follows. If a threshold is real, what does it mean that you have been standing at it every year of your life without knowing it was there? What have you been walking past? What has been waiting on the other side of a door you did not know was a door? Because here is what every tradition we have examined agrees on. The new moon of March is not just a time of reflection, it is a time of decision. It is the moment when the earth opens back up, as Aunt Sally said, and you have to be ready when the ground opens. It is the moment when the slate of the previous cycle is cleared and the new one begins. And what you plant in that cleared ground in the days following the new moon will shape what grows in the months ahead. Reflection without decision is nostalgia. Sacred time without action is performance. The traditions that kept this threshold alive across 400 years of suppression did not keep it alive so that a generation in 2026 could simply find it interesting. They kept it alive because they believed they knew that a generation was coming that would need it. A generation that would arrive at this threshold having carried the weight of everything winter holds, and would need to know that the ground was opening and that something could grow. That generation is you. That moment is now, and the moon is about to rise. Now I am going to open the vault, not describe it from the outside, not tell you that something significant is inside and leave you at the door. I am going to take you in, tradition by tradition, and show you specifically what the new moon of March looks like when a community that never forgot it gathers to observe it. What the practices are, what the theology behind them is, what it means in each tradition to stand at this threshold and respond to it with intention rather than letting it pass like any other night. Because this is the part that has been missing from your education, not the history, not the politics, the practice, the living, embodied, specific practice of treating sacred time as sacred. Every new moon in the Ifa tradition is a spiritual event. But not every new moon carries the same weight. The new moon of the season, when the dry Harmattan winds give way to the first rains, the new moon that arrives when the earth of West Africa shifts from dust to fertility, is the moon of Oshun. Oshun is the Orisha of rivers, of sweetness, of love, of abundance, and of the creative force that makes new life possible. She is not a minor figure in the Yoruba pantheon. She is one of the most powerful and most widely honored of all the Orishas, present in every expression of Yoruba tradition that survived the diaspora, in Cuban Lukumi, in Brazilian Candomblé, in Trinidad Orisha tradition, in the growing Ifa communities across the United States. And her energy is most accessible, most potent, most directly available to those who seek it at the new moon of the spring season. What does honoring Oshun at the new moon of March look like in practice? It begins with water. Oshun's domain is the river, and her first requirement is that you come to her clean, not just physically clean, but intentionally clean. Practitioners bathe before any ceremony in her honor, and the bath itself is ritual. It is not hygiene. It is preparation. You are removing from your body and your energy field the residue of what the previous cycle left behind, the grief, the stagnation, the accumulated weight of winter, so that you can stand before her threshold, unburdened and open. The offerings placed for Oshun at the new moon are specific. Honey, always honey, because sweetness is her signature and her gift. Oranges. River water, if it can be obtained. Yellow flowers, because yellow is her color, the color of sunlight on moving water. A candle, lit at the moment of the new moon's arrival, to acknowledge that a new cycle has begun, and you are present for it, awake to it, intending something inside of it. And then comes the prayer. Not a general prayer, a specific, intentional articulation of what you are beginning in this new cycle, what you are releasing from the last one, what you are asking Oshun to sweeten, because her specific gift is not just abundance in the material sense. Her gift is the quality of experience. She sweetens what has been bitter, she softens what has been hard, she opens what has been closed. And the new moon is when her capacity to do that is most available, because the new moon is when the slate is most fully clear and the intention most fully received. This is not passive spirituality. This is active engagement with sacred time. You bring something to this threshold. You bring your honesty about what the last cycle cost you, and your clarity about what you want the new one to hold. And Oshun, in the Yoruba understanding, meets that honesty and that clarity with a creative force that moves in the direction of your intention. The Ethiopian Orthodox observance of March does not look like a new moon ceremony in the way that Yoruba tradition structures it. It looks like something that Western Christianity would recognize as Lent, but older than Lent, deeper than Lent, and rooted in a theological understanding that has not been filtered through Roman institutional priorities. The Great Fast of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, called Abi Tsom, is 55 days long. It is the most intensive fasting period in the Ethiopian liturgical calendar, and it falls squarely across the month of Megabit, which is the Ethiopian month that overlaps with our March. During this period, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians abstain from all animal products, pray multiple times daily, attend extended church services, and engage in a practice of communal and personal examination that goes significantly deeper than simply giving something up for the season. What the Ethiopian tradition understands about this period that the Western Lenten tradition has largely lost is this: fasting is not primarily about deprivation, it is about receptivity. When you reduce what you consume physically, informationally, socially, you increase your capacity to receive. The noise level of ordinary life drops. The body becomes quieter. The spirit becomes more audible. The ancestors become more accessible. The divine presence that is always there but usually drowned out by the volume of daily life becomes something you can actually hear. The Ethiopian Orthodox community does not observe this season alone. That is the other thing that distinguishes it from the privatized spirituality that Western Christianity often produces. The fasting is communal. The prayers are communal. The examination is individual, but the container for it is shared. You are not sitting alone in your apartment trying to be more spiritual. You are gathered with your people, and your people are gathered with theirs. And the collective weight of that communal intention creates a spiritual atmosphere that individual practice cannot generate. And at the end of this March season of fasting and reflection comes Fasika, the Ethiopian Passover, the celebration of the resurrection, the feast that breaks the fast. The movement from March's emptying to April's fullness is not accidental. It is the entire theological point. You cannot receive the fullness of what Fasika offers if you have not done the work of March. The feast requires the fast. The opening requires the clearing. The new life requires the honest reckoning with what in you needs to die. In Hoodoo, the new moon of March is the most potent new moon of the year for works of new beginning. Not because a practitioner decided it, because the land itself decided it, and the tradition simply paid attention to what the land was saying. The specific practice attached to this threshold in Hoodoo is twofold. First, the clearing. Everything in the home that is old, broken, energetically heavy, or spiritually stagnant is removed, physically removed, cleaned around, or spiritually cleansed, using specific herbs and washes whose properties the tradition has documented across generations. Florida water, hyssop, pine. The smell of these cleansings is still recognizable to anyone who grew up in a household that maintained this tradition, even if the household never called it hoodoo. Even if the grandmother who did it called it simply cleaning the house. Second, the planting. Hoodoo practitioners plant intentions at the new moon, the same way a farmer plants seeds with specific knowledge of timing, of soil condition, of what each seed requires to grow. A new moon intention is not a wish, it is a planting. It requires preparation of the ground, which the clearing accomplishes. It requires a specific and honest articulation of what you are beginning, not a vague hope, but a clear declaration. It requires follow-through, tending the intention in the days and weeks that follow, not planting it and walking away. The most powerful roots gathered for new beginning workings are gathered in March, at or just after the new moon, in the morning before sunrise, when the dew is still on the ground. The timing is not arbitrary. It reflects a precise understanding of when the plant's spiritual properties are most concentrated at the moment of its own new beginning. When it has just emerged from the ground for the first time in the season, carrying inside it the full force of what it has been building through the dormancy of winter. In Rastafari tradition, the spring equinox, falling in the same week as the new moon of March in most years, is observed through a practice called reasoning. A reasoning is a communal gathering for deep, extended, spiritually serious conversation, not small talk, not entertainment. A deliberate collective turning of the community's attention toward the most important questions they are carrying, about faith, about justice, about the condition of the people, about what Jah is requiring of this generation right now. The equinox reasoning of March is understood as a recalibration. After the long internal season of winter, the community gathers to ask, where are we? What did the last cycle teach us? What is the new cycle calling for? The balance of the equinox, equal light and equal darkness, is itself a teaching. It asks you to look honestly at both sides of what you carry, the light you have cultivated and the darkness you have not yet faced. The Rastafari tradition does not flinch from that examination. It structures sacred time around the invitation to make it. In Kemetic practice, Wepet Renpet observance at the spring equinox involves an offering to Thoth, the divine principle of sacred time, and a formal declaration of the new cycle's intention. Practitioners write what they are releasing on paper and burn it. They write what they are beginning and keep it sometimes buried in soil, sometimes placed on an altar, always treated as a living document rather than a passing thought. What all 5 of these practices share across every difference of theology and geography and historical circumstance is this: they require your presence, they require your honesty, they require you to bring something to the threshold rather than simply standing at the door and looking in. The new moon of March is not a spectator event. It is an invitation to participate in the rhythm of sacred time. And you have been standing outside that rhythm for long enough. The door is open. The ground is ready. Step through. I have laid a great deal of evidence before you. Documents, calendars, theological frameworks, archaeological records, community surveys, historical laws, the names of months that still carry inside them the fingerprints of a starting line that was moved. I have shown you the pattern from above, the way you would see a river system from an airplane, the tributaries, the confluences, the direction of the current. But now I want to bring you down to the ground. I want to show you 3 faces, 3 people, 3 lives in which everything we have been discussing is not theory but lived experience, not pattern but person. Because the most important things are never fully understood from the altitude of scholarship. They are understood in the specific, in the human, in the story of one person standing at a threshold and choosing to cross it. Margaret is 63 years old. She was raised in the street, Roche neighborhood of New Orleans, in a household that was, by any external measure, thoroughly Baptist. Her grandmother was a deaconess. Her mother sang in the choir. Margaret herself was baptized at 11, confirmed at 14, and spent the better part of 4 decades in the same congregation without ever questioning the framework she had been handed. But every year, without fail, her grandmother did something in March that nobody in the church ever explained. In the last days of February, her grandmother would begin what she called the putting away. Every drawer in the house was emptied and wiped clean. Every closet was taken apart and rebuilt. Every corner was swept, every surface washed. Every object that had not been used or loved in the previous year was removed from the house entirely. It was not spring cleaning in the casual American sense. It was methodical. It was sequenced, always moving from the back of the house to the front, always ending at the front door, always finishing with a wash of the doorstep, with water that had been prepared the night before, with ingredients Margaret was not allowed to touch. On the night of the new moon, her grandmother lit a single white candle in the front room. She sat with it in silence for a long time. She spoke names aloud that Margaret did not recognize, names that were not in the family Bible, names that sounded older than English. Then she blew the candle out, went to bed, and the next morning she was different, lighter. Margaret said it every time she tried to describe it. Her grandmother was lighter in March than she was in any other month of the year. Margaret did not understand what her grandmother was doing until she was 51 years old, and a friend handed her a book about hoodoo practice in the American South. She sat with that book for 3 days, and on the 3rd day she called her cousin in Houston and said, "Grandmama was a root worker. She never stopped. She just never told us what to call it." Margaret observes the new moon of March now. She has for 12 years. She does the putting away. She washes the doorstep. She lights the candle and speaks the names, including her grandmother's name, which she now understands was always supposed to be in that list. And every March morning after the new moon, she says the same thing her cousin said when she first described what she had found. "I always knew something was happening in March. I just did not have the word for it." Darius is 34 years old, a seminary-trained theologian who grew up in a Pentecostal household in southwest Atlanta and spent 6 years in a graduate program studying African-American religious history. He is still Christian. He is also a student of Kemetic spirituality. He does not experience these as contradictions. What changed him was a single sentence he encountered in his 3rd year of graduate study. He was reading a paper on the history of black church revival traditions in the American South, and the paper noted, almost in passing, that the overwhelming majority of documented revival seasons in 19th and early 20th century Black Baptist and Pentecostal churches were scheduled in late winter and early spring. The paper offered a practical explanation. Agricultural communities had more time for extended church gatherings before planting season began. Darius put the paper down and sat for a long time, because he had grown up in a church that held its annual revival in the 2nd week of March every year, without exception. And nobody had ever given him an agricultural explanation for it. Nobody had said anything about planting seasons. What they said was that March was when the Spirit moved most powerfully. That was the language. The Spirit moves in March. Come ready to receive. Darius began pulling threads. He found that the pattern held not just in his church but across dozens of documented black congregations in the historical record. March revivals, March renewals. March as the season of spiritual intensification, year after year, congregation after congregation, with no coordinating institution to explain the consistency. He wrote his dissertation on it. His argument, documented across 200 pages of primary sources, was that the black church's relationship with March as a season of spiritual intensification is not explained by agricultural convenience. It is explained by something much older, by a body memory of sacred time that survived the Middle Passage, survived conversion, survived institutional Christianity's complete absence of lunar calendar observance, and expressed itself in the only language the institution permitted revival. Renewal, the Spirit moving, in March. His dissertation committee passed it unanimously. His advisor, a white scholar of American religious history, told him afterward that it was the most important argument about the continuity of African spiritual practice in the diaspora that he had read in 30 years of scholarship. Darius now teaches a class in Atlanta for young black Christians and spiritual seekers who want to understand the African roots of their spiritual inheritance. He begins every class in March, at the new moon. Miss Ivy is 81 years old. She has been Rastafari for 60 years. She was among the generation that received Haile Selassie at the Kingston Airport in 1966, and she will tell you, if you ask her, that she felt the ground shift that day in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd and everything to do with the season. It was April, just past the spring equinox, just past what she calls the turning. Miss Ivy has observed the March threshold every year of her adult life, not as a formal ceremony with a name she learned from a book, as a practice she developed in conversation with elder Rastafari women who taught her that the equinox was a time of weighing equal light and equal dark, the universe asking you to be honest about both sides of what you carry. Every March, Miss Ivy fasts for 3 days around the equinox, not from food entirely, but from noise. No radio, no conversation beyond what is necessary, no music except the music she makes herself, singing quietly to Jah in the early mornings before the sun comes up. She says the silence is where the weighing happens. She says you cannot hear what needs to go if you never stop talking long enough to listen. On the 3rd morning, she breaks the fast with a specific meal she has made every year, for 60 years, the same ingredients, prepared the same way, eaten alone before anyone else in the house is awake. She will not tell you what is in it. She says some things are not for explaining, they are for doing. What she will tell you is this: every year she arrives at April lighter than she left February. Every year something that was stuck has moved. Every year the ground opens, and she is ready, because she spent March getting ready. She learned it from a woman who learned it from a woman who learned it from a woman whose name nobody remembers anymore, but whose knowledge is still alive, right now, in a house in Kingston, in the hands of an 81-year-old woman who still gets up before sunrise in March to do the work. That is what survival looks like. That is what a guardian looks like. And that guardian is not a metaphor. She is a person. She is specific. She is real. And she is the reason this knowledge is still here for you to receive. Now I know what some of you are thinking right now. You have been with me through 8 sections of this. You have heard the evidence. You have heard the stories. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice has been forming a response. Maybe it is the voice of your pastor. Maybe it is the voice of your own theological training. Maybe it is the voice of the part of you that was raised to be careful about anything that does not come stamped with the approval of the tradition you grew up inside. And that voice is asking a question. So, let me answer it directly, because I respect you too much to pretend the objection is not there. The first objection sounds like this: is this not just paganism? Is not all this talk of moons and ancestors and seasonal ceremonies exactly the kind of thing that the Bible warns against? Are we not being led away from God by dressing up ancient superstition in academic language? Here is my answer, and I need you to hear it carefully. Open your Bible to Numbers 28-11. God commands the observance of the new moon. Open Psalm 81-3. God commands the blowing of the horn at the new moon. Open Isaiah 66-23. The prophet describes the restored world as one in which every new moon is marked in worship. The God of your Bible established the new moon as a sacred threshold. That is not paganism. That is scripture. The tradition that labeled lunar observance as primitive was not the tradition that wrote the Bible. It was the tradition that edited it. The second objection sounds like this. My church never taught me any of this, and my church has been faithful for generations. Are you saying everything they taught me was wrong? No. That is not what I am saying. And I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters enormously. I am not saying your church was wrong about God. I am saying your church may not have had access to the full picture of your spiritual inheritance. There is a difference between a tradition that deceives you and a tradition that was itself operating with an incomplete library. The women and men who built the black church in America did something extraordinary. They took a partial inheritance handed to them under conditions of violence and forced conversion, and they built something that carried an entire people through the unsurvivable. That deserves profound respect. But respecting what they built does not require you to pretend the library was complete. It requires you to go find the missing books, for them, in their honor. The third objection is the one that comes from the youngest voices, and it sounds like this. Does not all this talk of special seasons and sacred calendars sound like New Age spirituality? Is this not just astrology repackaged for people who want to feel connected to something ancient? Here is what I want you to understand about that objection. The practices we have examined in this video are not new. Ifa is at minimum 4,000 years old. The Kemetic sacred calendar predates the Roman Empire by 2 millennia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been practicing its liturgical calendar continuously since the 1st century. These traditions were ancient when the New Age movement was not even an idea. Calling them New Age is like calling a grandmother a trend. It gets the timeline exactly backwards. What the New Age movement did was borrow fragments of these systems, strip them of their cultural and theological context, and sell them back to a mainstream audience. The original is not responsible for what was done with the copy. And here is the thing that ties all three objections together. The thing underneath all of them that I want to name directly, because naming it is the only way through it. All three objections are really one objection. They are all asking the same question in different language. And the question is this: is it safe for me to claim this? Is it safe to say that my spiritual inheritance is older and deeper and wider than what I was handed? Is it safe to reach back past the missionary and the slave ship and the colonial mission school and find something that belonged to my people before any of that happened? Is it safe to stand at a threshold that my grandmothers stood at without knowing what to call it and finally put a name on it? Yes, it is not only safe, it is necessary. Not to replace what you have, to complete it, to hold the full inheritance that was always yours and was always waiting for you to be ready to receive it. The threshold is real. The moon is real. March is real. And you are ready. Before we go any further, I need to stop. I need to stop because what we have laid on the table today is not the kind of thing you can process with your mind alone. The mind can follow an argument. The mind can evaluate evidence. The mind can weigh one source against another and arrive at a conclusion. But what we have been talking about today goes deeper than argument. It goes deeper than evidence. It goes into the place in you where your ancestors live. And that place does not respond to logic. It responds to prayer. So I am going to pray. And I am going to ask you to pray with me. Not in the way you perform prayer in public. Not with the voice you use when someone is watching. With the real voice. The one that comes up from the bottom of you. The one your grandmother used in the quiet of the early morning before anyone else in the house was awake. That voice. Bring that voice right now. Let us pray together. God of every name your people have ever called you. Olodumare. Jah. the Ancient of Days, the God of Abraham and the God of the Nile, the God who spoke to Moses in the wilderness and spoke to the Ethiopian official in a chariot on a desert road, and spoke to the monks in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, who copied manuscripts by candlelight so that a generation they would never meet would have access to the truth. You are the same God. You have always been the same God. And we come before you right now with open hands. We come with gratitude first, because we are alive in a moment when the things that were hidden are being made visible. We are alive in a moment when a generation is turning around and asking the questions that were too dangerous to ask out loud for 400 years. We are grateful for that. We are grateful for every ancestor who kept something alive when keeping it cost them something. We are grateful for the grandmothers who cleared their houses in March without knowing the full name of what they were doing, but knowing in their bodies that it mattered. We are grateful for the monks who kept copying. We are grateful for the drummers who kept the rhythm in their memories after the drums were taken. We are grateful for every chain of transmission that survived when everything around it was designed to break it. We come now and ask for the courage to receive what was always ours, because receiving it is not automatic. Receiving it requires something from us. It requires us to be honest about what the last cycle cost us, to name it, to put it down, to stop carrying it into the new one, the way you carry furniture from a house you already moved out of, dragging the weight of a space you no longer live in into every room of the life you are trying to build. God, we ask you to help us put it down, whatever it is. The grief that has become so familiar, it feels like identity. The bitterness that started as protection and stayed past its usefulness. The story we have been telling about ourselves that was never true, but got repeated so many times it started to feel like fact. We ask for the grace to set it down at this threshold, to leave it here, to walk through the new moon of March into the new cycle without it. And we ask for something else. We ask for the names. Because many of us listening right now do not know the names of our ancestors. The chain was broken, the records were destroyed, or were never kept. We carry people inside us whose names we cannot speak because nobody wrote them down, or because what was written was the name the Master gave them and not the name their mothers spoke over them at birth. God, we ask you to hold those names. We ask you to receive the prayer of their descendants, even when those descendants do not know what to call the ones they are honoring. We ask you to bridge the gap that history made, and we ask for protection over this generation of seekers, over every person who is turning around right now, over every young person who is reaching back past the edited version to find what was there before the editing. Protect them from the voices that will call that reaching dangerous. Protect them from the fear that says it is safer to stay with the incomplete library than to go looking for the missing books. Protect them with the truth. Because the truth, when it is the real truth and not the managed version, is the most powerful protection there is. We plant something in this prayer, an intention for this new cycle, that the knowledge will keep moving, that the chain will keep holding, that the moon will keep rising over people who know what it means and are ready when the ground opens. Amen. You made it to the end. And I want you to understand something about that. In a world that is designed to fragment your attention into 15-second pieces, in a culture that measures everything in clicks and swipes and the dopamine hit of the next notification, you just sat with thousands of years of suppressed truth for the length of this entire video. You did not skip ahead. You did not click away when the evidence got heavy or when the prayer got personal. You stayed. That is not nothing. That is your spirit recognizing something it has been hungry for without knowing exactly what the hunger was. Let me tell you what we laid on the table today. We established that the calendar you live inside is not neutral. It was built by specific people at a specific moment in history for specific political and institutional purposes. and the communities whose spiritual relationship with time it replaced were not consulted, were not represented, and were not compensated for what was taken from them. We showed that March was the original beginning, that the names of the months still carry the evidence of a starting line that was moved, and that the earth itself, in every hemisphere that has ever produced an agricultural civilization, has always understood March as the genuine threshold of renewal. We traveled across 5 traditions: Yoruba and Ifa, Ethiopian Orthodox, Hoodoo and Conjure, Rastafari, and Kemetic spirituality, and we showed that every one of them, independently, across centuries of separation and oceans of distance, arrived at the same sacred understanding about this month and this moon. We showed that this convergence is not coincidence, it is a language that was spoken fluently by African and African-descended communities long before any colonial institution arrived to tell them their relationship with time was primitive. We showed how that language was targeted for erasure. The drums silenced, the ceremonies criminalized, the lunar calendar replaced with a solar one that had no room for the thresholds your ancestors honored. And we showed how the knowledge survived anyway. In the ring shouts of the hush harbors, in the candomblé ceremonies of Bahia, in the hands of women like Aunt Sally and Margaret and Miss Ivy, who kept doing in March what their grandmothers did in March, without always having the full language to explain why. We showed you 3 faces, 3 lives, 3 people who arrived at this threshold from different directions and found the same thing waiting for them on the other side. And we asked the question that I want to leave you with now, the question I hope you carry into everything that follows. What have you been walking past every march of your life without knowing it was a door? Because the door is still there. It does not expire. It does not close because you missed it last year or the year before or the decade before that. The new moon of March rises, whether you are ready for it or not. The question is only whether you will be ready this time. Now, I need you to do something. Several things, in this order. First, if this video spoke to something real in you today, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notification bell. Not as a favor to me. As a commitment to yourself, every subscriber is a signal to the algorithm that this kind of deep, documented, spiritually serious content deserves to keep reaching people. Position yourself to receive what is coming next. Second, drop a comment right now. Type the words, "I am the Guardian," and tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, your tradition. I want to see the grandmother in New Orleans, next to the theology student in Accra, next to the young woman in London, next to the elder in Kingston, next to the seeker in Houston, who has been asking questions that nobody in their congregation will answer. All of them in the same comment section, all of them saying the same thing, because that is what you are. You are not a passive recipient of someone else's sacred calendar. You are a guardian of your own. Third, share this video before you close it. Not later. Now. Send it to the person in your family who has always felt that something was missing from the spiritual inheritance they were handed. Send it to the friend who lights a candle every new moon, but has never had language for why it matters. Send it to the young person in your life who is reaching back and needs to know that what they are reaching for is real and documented and waiting for them. Fourth, here are the specific things I am asking you to do this week. Find the date of the next new moon and put it in your calendar as a sacred event. Research the tradition that is closest to your own ancestral inheritance and learn what that tradition specifically does at the new moon of March. Talk to the oldest person in your family and ask them what March meant in your household when they were growing up. You may be surprised by what they remember. And this week, before the moon rises, do the clearing. Whatever that means for you. A drawer, a room, a conversation you have been postponing, a grief you have been carrying past its season. Clear something, make room, because the ground is opening and you need to be ready. One more thing before I let you go. The next video in this series is going to take you inside one tradition at a time. We are going to sit inside the Ifa new moon ceremony in full detail. We are going to read the Ethiopian fasting texts in translation. We are going to trace the hoodoo spring practice back to its West African roots, source by source. If what I showed you today opened the door, the next video is going to walk you all the way through it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, do not miss it. You came into this video living inside a calendar that was not built for you. You are leaving with the knowledge that your ancestors built one that was. A calendar written in the language of the moon and the soil and the returning light of spring. A calendar that has been waiting in the bodies and the practices and the march habits of your people for longer than the empire that tried to erase it has existed. Walk into March accordingly. Pray accordingly. Clear accordingly. Plant accordingly. The ground is open. Go be the guardian.